The International Christian Embassy Jerusalem is your embassy in the heart of Israel, founded in 1980. From our headquarters in Jerusalem through our branches in over 80 nations and yours in Canada, we seek to challenge the church to take up its scriptural responsibility, to remind Israel of the promises made to her in the Bible, and to be a source of practical assistance to all the people in the land of Israel. On today's program, a panel discussion about the Palestinians seeking to sue Britain over the Balfour Declaration. A visit to the historic Magdala to explore the first-century port marketplace in Israel. Join Christian pilgrims who share their visit to the Holy Land. Zechariah chapter 2, verse 8. For thus said the Lord of hosts, after his glory sent me to the nations who plundered you, for he who touches you touches the apple of his eye.
Welcome to our panel discussion on Inside Israel. My guests today joining me, Bob Mayton, Corey Hembry-Bebechko, and Mark Vondermas. Our discussion today is about a Palestinian campaign to sue Britain and demand reparation over the Balfour Declaration. And one of our guests, Mark, deals a lot with the Balfour Declaration. So, Mark, before giving an opinion, if you can just briefly let our audience know about the Balfour Declaration and just kind of set up what you think of that suit based on the facts of the Balfour Declaration.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. I'm so excited that you're doing this topic because this is my ministry. My ministry is sharing the really great news with Jews and other Zionists about Israel's land title deed. Now, the Balfour Declaration is not the land title deed, as I like to call it. It is a spark. It is actually not an act of international law. It was just a letter written in 1917 by Lord Balfour, in which he expressed the opinion on behalf of Great Britain that the Jews should have a homeland or restore a homeland in Palestine. The letter found its way into the San Remo conferences after World War I, where all of the world powers, the Allied powers, got together and lawfully decided. They heard all of the different claims from Arabs, from Jews, as to how the land should be divided. And then they created a mandate system. And there's a thing called the Mandate for Palestine. Syria and Lebanon were parts of the mandate system, and there were other countries out of the Middle East. So there are a number of, altogether about 14 countries created under the mandate system. So the Balfour Declaration was that spark of hope to the Jewish people. It's not an instrument of law, but it was that spark. And it is referenced in this magnificent document called the Mandate for Palestine. And it is in the preamble. It's referenced, not by name, but it's clear that they're referring to it. So, and in the Mandate for Palestine, which was issued by the world, this is the world's promises to the Jewish people, that they recognize their ancient claims to the land of Israel, and that they were authorizing the Jews to settle all of the land on the west side of the Jordan River. The Jews were originally promised land on the eastern side of Jordan River as well, but Article 25 of the mandate gave the mandatory power, which would be Great Britain, the authority to sever that off from the Jewish people, and they did in fact do that via something called the Note Re Transjordan. So it's a very important story. It's very important legally because it clearly defines where the Jews were supposed to live in black and white. And unfortunately for the Israelis, their government doesn't seem to understand the power of this document, the existence
yes, but we need
of
to
this
get
document.
in now to the Palestinian campaign.
I'm going to talk about that. They don't understand the importance of it, but the Palestinians, the Arabs, understand that this document, its mere existence, proves that all the lies about occupation are nonsense, and they have to try and destroy it. So now they're planning on filing a lawsuit. They've actually filed a petition with the British government, and that petition only had 13,000 signatures, and yet the British government is trying to go back 100 years now and deny the terms of the Balfour Declaration. It's an outrageous assault on Israel, on history, and on the truth, And it's another example of the world trying to go back on its promises to the Jewish people.
Yes. And about Palestinian propaganda as well.
Well, exactly. It's
all
pure.
through.
It's pure
I mean, this
propaganda.
is a Palestinian campaign here.
Well, exactly. It's outrageous on the surface, and it is a clear attempt to deny the history of the Jewish people and the whole world. This document came from the whole world. Didn't come from just Great Britain. All of the claims of the Middle East were heard, and the Allied powers made their decisions, and nobody questions the borders of any other state, or Arab or otherwise. Only the Jewish state is singled out for special treatment, and I use that term deliberately.
Mark, thank you for explaining that, because that's a complex topic that you educated on in very short. So I want to thank you so much for that. Corey, your thoughts on this ridiculous
Well,
suit?
What really astounds me about it when I began to do a little bit of looking and digging into it is again just the outrageous rhetoric that's being spouted around it. Claims like the Balfour Declaration being the greatest crime of the century or the beginning of the great Palestinian Holocaust. It's very offensive to those of us who hold history in a high regard. And I think that's what's missing from the news media. That's what's missing from certain university campuses who are holding rallies against Israel, is that they are forgetting that there is actual historical truth that happened, and you can find it if you look for it, but you have to care about historical truth. And I think that the only way that we can move forward, as the world, aiming for peace, is by looking for what actually happened in history and toning down the childish nature of trying to be the loudest, most outrageous voice.
Yes.
There should not be room for that on the world stage, but unfortunately that's what we're seeing more and more.
Bob, I'm going to get to you shortly, but I want to ask you one question first before I move on, Mark. And this is this is your personal opinion. How far do you think this is going to go? Do you think they'll get far with this lawsuit? I mean, it's based on lies, but do you think they'll possibly succeed?
They're geniuses. Israel's enemies are geniuses at propaganda, and they've already scored this huge victory just in this petition by getting Her Majesty's government to respond to it and say that, yeah, we messed up on the Balfour Declaration. That is enormous. So that petition is going to find its way into the lawsuit, and we learn one thing. And it doesn't matter whether it's a kind of a local court or an international court of public opinion, justice does not always find its way out of the courtroom. And I think it's really sad. What's really fun, what's really amazing to me, I've trained over 450 people personally using this booklet. And I always ask my audiences, how many of you have heard of the Balfour Declaration? How many of you have heard of the Mandate for Palestine? How many of you have heard of San Remo Conference? Okay, how many of you have actually read the words of Israel's land title deed? Would you believe out of 450 people, fewer than 10 have actually read it? So it's not shocking to me when, especially Jews, are out there believe this occupation nonsense, because this material, believe it or not, and this is straight from experts, is not taught in the Israeli school system.
One little comment, this is relevant, off topic, but very relevant. Britain at this time has at least 90 Sharia courts. That should tell you something.
Wow.
Bob?
Well, I'm a little concerned about this. First of all, I should say that Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that this is just another example of how the Palestinians don't want to recognize the state of Israel, and that there's no point in negotiating with people who don't even recognize your right to exist over a peace process and about a two-state solution, etc. The second thing is that it's about the right to return. Reparations are about the people. The suit is really about the people who left during the so-called Nakba, the catastrophe that happened in 1948, when the Muslim population, the Palestinian population, left Israel to settle in other places because of the war that was declared on Israel at the time, in which they thought that there'd be a lot of deaths. So it's about the right of return. They lost property and they lost a lot of things. They made a choice to leave, but what they want is the right of return. If they come back, of course, the right of Israel to exist would basically be threatened, because they would have a lot of votes, and a return en masse would would overcome the Jewish identity of Israel. And the third thing is that the politics of this, I think as Mark and Corey have already mentioned, that the politics of this, it's not really clear. I mean, when we're talking now about impeaching President Trump for nothing, that there's no evidence that there was any relationship with Russia and all the issues around that. The courts and the political situation doesn't seem to recognize anymore the legalities of situations and whether things are legitimate or not. There's a lot of social intervention by the courts. We know that there are a lot of left-wingers on the International Court of Justice. Reparations to Palestinians who lost property sounds like an idea that they might entertain, and I would really be concerned about that. I don't think that Israel would be coerced into paying it. I think that it would set them against the United Nations to an extent. But I think it's really interesting also that the Palestinians have addressed the issue through the Balfour Declaration. Rather than confronting the United Nations directly, because the United Nations inherited all of the decisions of the League of Nations, and was the instrument that established Israel in 1948. The League of Nations was about the establishment of the mandate for Palestine, which followed the Balfour Declaration. They haven't gone after that because that would undermine their relationship with the United Nations. What they've done is they've gone directly to Britain, who really is in a weak position at the moment because of their conflict with the EU, because of the Brexit. Britain now has other issues that it has to contend with. And Britain is a bit of a pariah in the world community at the moment because of globalization, standing against globalization, which is the dominant direction of the elites across the world, as we know. So Britain is in a tough position.
So they may not go along with this. Is that what your point is? Because we're going to have to move along for time.
Do we have time
We're way
for
over
some good
time.
news?
Yeah.
We're way over time.
Way
here.
over time? Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So
Great points,
enough.
but we're just way over time. I hope you didn't have anything else to say there. I just cut you off there.
No.
If you have time, I got some good news for you.
Okay, I want to hear that before we close.
Yeah.
Okay, the good news is the first time I did training with this document, I got this emotional email from a Jewish woman who is actually a land rights expert. And she said to me, quote, "Mark, all my life, I never had a copy of my country's land title deed until you, a Christian, put one in my hands." And I think that if we could recreate that experience 10,000 times, so we had an army of mandate ambassadors out there, I think we could actually make a difference in the world. So thank you.
Okay, nice positive note to end on.
Up next, a visit to Magdala, first century port marketplace in Israel.
So this was the marketplace of the first century port. And as we were filming just outside here,
Out here was the port.
you have also
market.
little walls and
Yes,
structures.
yes.
So you can see where they had maybe storage, where they kept fish, where they kept their tackle, where they brought supplies for their boats, where people were sending stuff over to the other side, to Capernaum, or bringing it back, whatever. So this was a very busy place. You don't build a solid platform like this unless you have traffic. It's too much work to build it. So this is prepared for heavy duty traffic. And we have a couple of historical references. This is first century. And we know from Flavius Josephus that 240 boats rescued the women and children from Magdala before the Romans came in with their swords to deal with the Jewish rebellion. Everybody in the world almost knows that Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 by the Romans. A lot of people who look at movies know that Masada fell 2 years later. Very few people know that the first battle was here. The rebellion started in Caesarea Maritima, it was squashed. They went into the countryside, they gathered here in Galilee, and this was a focal point, one of the focal points. And this story is amply described by Flavius Josephus because he himself actually led the rebellion against the Romans here. He organized them. He's fortified the northern wall in the city, which you saw over there in the archaeology.
Right.
He tells us that fish processed in Magdala was sold in Rome. No wonder, because Caesarea Maritima was the most important port in the Roman Empire, the most beautiful port that Herod the Great had built. So the infrastructure was there for that type of... Now we found the fish processing units with the shafts, with the steps and the basins where they were tossing the fish. And we know from the Greek name for Magdala was Taricheia, which means tossing. And that's part of the pickling process of pickling the fish so that it would be preserved for the long trip to Rome, for sale in Rome. Now put yourself in the context of fishermen in the Sea of Galilee. If you want to get an extra penny on the pound, you do export. They bring it here, and there's a port big enough to receive it. And then they take it and bring it over to these pickling units, and there we have 10 of them. That is an industrial process. It's like a factory, and it's exported. A couple of days walk
Boxed
to.
in salt, wouldn't it?
Probably, yeah. They'd be well pickled
So the
first.
port was Caesarea, and you can see that evidence there as well.
Well, it's only a couple of days from here to,
Yes,
with mules to go to Caesarea. So it's all very practical. And this would also explain why there's such an income here that allows the building of such an ornate synagogue that's completely frescoed, completely mosaiced, so well built, and then the ritual purification baths that are extraordinary in terms of level. So we're now discovering here in the first century a very stratified society, definitely a very professional or qualified working class that's able to build, a professional working crew for stone, for engineering, for planning, for organization. So for the fish industry, there has to be a management level, there has to be connecting people, salespeople. So you have a complex society here. And that's a very interesting observation about how we have to rethink the society in which Jesus moved. We can remember again what we saw upstairs with the columns, that we have Mary Magdalene,
Right.
Susanna and Johanna, the wife of Herod Antipas's finance minister. Now Herod Antipas is the king. His most trusted person is in charge of his finances, probably. And Herod Antipas and Jesus weren't on the best of terms. And yet his most trusted man's wife was probably secretly or quietly, discreetly, a disciple. And then Luke's Gospel chapter 8 in the first 3 verses goes on to say that these women and many others supported Jesus from their substance. And Mary Magdalene is ahead of Susanna and Johanna, and you normally recognize benefactors in order of importance in any work, and from antiquity that's been the same. We can see it on monuments, even in the synagogue in Cana. You have people that are honored for building the synagogue. So, and you have bigger letters for bigger donors.
True.
So then this means that if Johanna, the wife of the finance minister, and they had deep pockets, there weren't the same ethics commissions ruling tax collection at the time and checking on them in congressional reports and so forth. So then you have to say, wow, these are a very top level of society, the creme de la creme in the socioeconomic categories that are involved in Jesus' discipleship. And these women have been touched by him, so he was able to reach their hearts, he was able to reach their soul, and they felt inspired by him. And then we could think about these people coming through here. They want to go to Capernaum to hear him preach, because he's living in Capernaum. They want to go to Bethsaida. Somebody got cured up near the Mount of Beatitudes. They're curious. They'd like to see this person that's raised from the dead, the daughter of Jairus. So they used the boats. Who walked on this floor? I'd love to make this little comment, how Pope Francis says that pastors should smell like the sheep, which means we shouldn't live aloof.
Right, live among them.
Yesterday we had 74 pastors from the Assemblies of God here
Okay.
in this chapel. And you know, I said, well, you probably don't follow Pope Francis, a little quip there. But if Pope Francis came here, he might have to say the pastors need to smell like fish, because Jesus would have smelled like fish. Like the fishermen are living, they're handling this all the time. So Jesus is among fishermen. They haul their fish in here. And Jesus got on the boat here and went across. They crossed to the other side. That language is frequent in the gospel, and we only probably get 2% of all the things that did happen in the Gospels, in the text of the Gospel of what happened in Jesus' ministry here in Galilee. So now this place becomes very special. You know, it's very possible that Peter stood on these stones. Can you imagine Jesus waiting for the boat to come in or waiting for them to unload? and there are a couple of people that are coming over, they're dealing with something. And he notices Mary Magdalene going by, and he says something that's more for her than for them. And it happens 2 or 3 times, and she's beginning to say, wow, this man is different. This person has a different message. He's touching my heart, he's touching my mind, he's touching my life. So then, at some point then, there's a connection. She says, I need to talk to him, I need help. So, this is where this is happening. And now we can see the structure here. We have seating like in the synagogue, columns like in the synagogue, and we sent some of the fresco samples from the synagogue to a lab in Germany, and they analyzed and identified the pigments and reproduced them to decorate this building.
These would be natural pigments, would they not?
So then imagine now you're here in a space that's authentic first century, and I even dare to say that maybe it's even more probable that Jesus walked on this floor than he walked in the synagogue. Something very interesting happened last summer. A friend of mine said, can you please give a special tour to a friend of mine who's coming? So a mutual friend introduced us, and this man was New Age, an entrepreneur from the US, a very successful entrepreneur. And when he was totally imbued with New Age thinking, when he came here and he understood this space, he took off his shoes, then he took off his socks, and he spent 10 minutes walking here. And he wanted to get the energy from the stones where Jesus walked. So this space is touching a lot of people, but obviously, first of all, in its visuals, it's telling us this is like the synagogue. And that has extraordinary meaning, because if we go to the synagogue, we can ask the question, who was using the synagogue? Well, obviously Jewish people. They built it. But among the Jewish people in the first century, they had a surprise in their synagogues one day, another day. A carpenter from Nazareth came by.
A Jew.
And he opened up the scriptures for them. And they called him Rabbi. It's very interesting that when Mary Magdalene experiences the risen Christ, her first word is Rabboni, my teacher. So this rabbi is in their synagogue. And then our synagogue, Christian talking, is closed down by 67, 68 at the latest, before temple destruction. And who's using the synagogue, let's say from Pentecost to 67, 68? Well, Jewish people. But if we look at the Acts of the Apostles, we see Peter and John coming out of the temple after the mid-afternoon prayer. And Peter cures the paralytic, right? There's that miracle. So if the apostles were the prime first row co-workers of Jesus' ministry are going to the temple, everybody's going to the temple. They didn't stop going to the temple. They didn't stop going to the synagogues. So who's using the synagogue? Jesus' disciples. Among the crowd of Jews. Maybe a significant portion here in Galilee. So then, what does that tell us? Why did we find the synagogue today, at the beginning of the 3rd millennium, the 21st century? Would it be fair to suspect that Providence wants us to look at what unites us? Because 2,000 years ago, they weren't divided into Presbyterian, Methodist, Assembly of God, Orthodox, Coptic. We were still one family of Jesus' disciples. And we were not yet separated from the Jews. So we had so much in common. And now we will never roll back completely the fragmentation and the development of peculiar and particular traditions to each faith community. But we do need to look at each other and say, you know, hold on a moment. We share a lot. We cannot afford to hate each other. We cannot afford to have negative prejudice toward each other. We need to discover why each community is doing this, what lies behind it, what's the significance, what's the intention, what are we pursuing? Are we on an ego trip? Just our understanding? Are we able to embrace the whole of the body? Are we able to open our hearts for the complete working of Christ in his body, in the church, in the world, in our time? So I think this discovery has been a great gift for us at this time.
So here we are in Israel, we're with Bonnie, and we've had a glorious week. The most memorable moment, I think, for me was on the Sea of Galilee, where we're out on the boat on the water, and we're singing praise and worship songs, and it's just as if there's a heavenly presence all around us. It was so breathtaking for me. I don't know about you, what was your favorite moment?
I think my favorite moment, but yet the hardest moment, was when we visited the Holocaust Museum today,
That was very emotional.
where you started to get more of an understanding of what the Jewish people have been through and the persecution, and it brought me to tears that I couldn't even make it through. I had to walk out because I was feeling such a hurt to the people that we don't need to put them through this.
We conclude our program today with some sights and sounds within Israel. Thank you for joining us today, and be sure to visit our website at www.icejcanada.tv or call us at 1-866-324-9133. Through your contribution to ICEJ Canada, you can participate by giving to Haifa Home for Holocaust Survivors, Women at Risk, Red Carpet Project, Operation Life Shield Bomb-Proof Shelters, Shoulder to Shoulder Alia Support, Beit Singers Children's Home, Israel in Crisis, ICEJ Communication Media Fund, Christian Friends of Yad Vashem, Magen David Adom Emergency Services, Canada Israel Young Adult Scholarships, Equip and Teach, Beit Rachel Strauss Inclusive Community, Gift Estate Securities Funds.